Okay, today's stuff we're going to be learning is Yevamot Daf Pei Daled. We're going to be finishing the 8th parak, moving on to the 9th parak, definitely reaching the final stretch of Masechet Yevamot. We still have a little while, but we're definitely getting closer to the end. Okay, today's daf, which is sponsorship, and then we'll get started. And there's also a study guide for today, which I know we haven't had in a while. It'll be very useful. So if you can access it while you're doing the class, it will be helpful. We're going to have a lot of cases. We're going to refer to them by numbers that I put in the sheet, so it'll make it easier for you. Today's daf is sponsored by David Wenner in honor of Yafa, joining Hadran's Daf Yomi from your loving family. Okay, we're going to start from the bottom of Pei Gimel Amud Bet, the very last line. We had yesterday that we were learning in the Mishnah about Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer has this approach, right? Many people we saw in the Mishnah had this approach. We're going to treat an androgynous as a male. And Rabbi Eliezer said for the purposes of mishkav zachar, of having relations with another male, we're going to treat him as a male and give him skila, stoning. And we saw some different explanations, but the main point for now is that he treats an androgynous like a male. So then Rav Shizbi said in the name of Rav Chisda that he actually doesn't believe this about everything. When it comes to sacrifices, for example, he doesn't say that. Okay, and then we saw this case about sacrifices that if you designate an animal for sacrifice, that animal is not sanctified because it has to be either male or female, right? We said we distinguish between birds and animals because birds, we said, don't have to be particularly male or female, and therefore the androgynous is okay. But when it comes to animals, it either says zachar or nekeva, right? Even if it says it could be either male or female, it has to be either male or female, and the androgynous is not included. So there you see that when it comes to animals, he has a different approach to the whole thing. Okay, to which then the Gemara says, by the way, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, he also says, Af ana nami tanina. I can also further prove this. How so? Rabbi Eliezer from another Tanaitic source. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Hakilayim utreifa v'yotzei dofen tumtum v'androgynous. We're now moving into laws of truma. Truma is laws of substitution. If I take an animal I designated, and then I decide I don't want that animal, I want a different animal instead, since I already designated and sanctified the first animal, I can't switch it for another animal. And not only can I not switch it, but if I do, both animals become sanctified. So my action was valid that I sanctified the second one as well. So now they say, however, when it comes to laws of Tmura substitution, they're not applicable to certain things, like an animal that's kilayim, that's a crossbreed of two animals, or a treifa, an animal that's about to die. It's within 12 months of death, it has some sort of health issue. Yotzei dofen, that was born C-section rather than natural birth, because it says ki yivaled. Okay, that's in the pasuk about sacrifices. If it's born, it has to be born in a natural manner. Tumtum v'androgynous. Okay, lo kadoshim v'lo makdishim. They're not sanctified and they can't sanctify other things. So Amar Shmuel explained, lo kadoshim b'tmura. If you made them tmura, like you took one of those animals to be a substitution. So I told you that the tmura becomes sanctified. This one doesn't, okay? If you made it a tmura, you said instead of this animal, this nice animal that I chose, I now want to choose one that's, let's say, an androgynous. Doesn't work, okay? And lo makdishin ba'oset tmura. If someone takes an animal they designated as androgynous, and then they said, and in place of this, I want to take a different one, the second one won't be in place of the first one. It won't even be sanctified because the first one wasn't sanctified. Or theoretically, what they're saying is the first one could have been sanctified because maybe you can't even be talking about tomorrow. It would have to be, and then there's a big question, what exactly is the case? And maybe it doesn't even apply to androgynous. It would be more the yotzei dofen, or like, okay, I'll give you an example of a yotzei dofen, or a treifa is the easiest. When I sanctified the first animal, it wasn't a treifa. Then before I did the tmura, the substitution, it became a treifa, it got sick. So that would be a case where the first animal was actually sanctified, but since now it's a treifa, it can't create a new substitution. If I say instead of this treifa animal, I'm substituting something else. Some people think that last line can't really apply to tumtum androgynous because they couldn't, even the first one couldn't have been sanctified. So of course it can't make a tmura. And this is only saying if the first one was actually sanctified and then became disqualified, then tmura wouldn't work. Okay, which you can find in a yotzei dofen. Okay, you might say, how could a yotzei dofen be a case? Because let's say you sanctify the animal while it was still in the womb, and then it came out as a yotzei dofen. So that would be an example also there. Okay, in any case, without getting into too many details of tmura, we have a long time till we get to Masechet Tmura and we learn all about this. The main point being that he clearly treats a truma and androgynous as an animal that can't be a tmura, as we already discussed, can't even be a regular sacrifice. Of course, can't be tmura. And again, you see the same thing here. Okay. Next, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Why did they bring this, by the way? Because the first source that we saw was really only, right, it said, no, the truth is the first source was pretty clear too. But there was the main topic was the oath, and it was the case where we accepted a truma and androgynous, and then it just kind of said, well, in a different case, like an animal, it seems like it would be on the outs, but it wasn't as explicit, and that's why maybe he brought this as well. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, last line for this chapter. It's an interesting way to end the chapter. Maybe before I read it, I'll already tell you what I was thinking about, which is, especially as you get to the words Hadron ala Ha'arel, which means, right, will remind us what chapter we're in. We're in the chapter Ha'arel, which started off with an uncircumcised person who can't eat truma, even though he's, part of the community. On the other hand, he can't eat truma because he's uncircumcised, even though he has an exemption from circumcision. He still is a little bit on the outs. So in light of that, I thought about this, interesting, and the whole chapter is really on people who are somewhat out of the community, right? They have issues. We talked about people who can't marry other people, etc. Anyway, it ends in an interesting note. Rabbi Eliezer Omer chayavim alav skila kizachar. They're just quoting that line, which we already talked about today. Tanya, they now bring a braita with a story. Amar Rebbe, who's Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who's the one who basically organizes the Mishna and puts it down into writing. Kshalachti l'mod Torah etzel Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua, chavru alai tamidav ketarnegolim shel beit bukya, ve'lo inichuni l'mod ela davar echad b'mishnatenu. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, androgynous chayavim alav skila kizachar. He said, when I went to learn by Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua, all his students ganged up on me like roosters in Beit Bukya. Okay, so Rashi explains what we're talking about here is he actually says something bikiim v'charifim. Okay, like the obviously the tarnagolim aren't bikiim v'charifim, right? Experts and very smart. That's all the smart students ganged up on him. Ve'em menichim tarnagol nochri benehem. They don't let someone who's different from them among them. In other words, Rebbe was an outsider, and they didn't want him to come and learn with them. So they basically bothered him so that he couldn't learn. They ganged up on him and wouldn't really let him learn Torah from Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua. Either they were making a ruckus, they were making noise, they were trying to stop him. And the only thing he managed to learn was that one line in our Mishnah that Rabbi Eliezer says, androgynous chayavim alav skila kizachar. Okay, which is a little bit strange, right? Actually, I now thought of something else about this, but maybe it's actually, I was trying to think of the connection with why this one thing. So what's interesting that's going on here is they're excluding Rebbe. Now, why are they excluding Rebbe is a good question. So some of the commentaries say they were worried that Rebbe was going to learn all these secret things that Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua knew and go tell them to people. Now, why would they think that? Well, what was Rebbe all about? Rebbe, right, we had this Torah Shabbal Peh that was passed down orally for generations. And Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did something radical. We think it's amazing what he did. He put it in writing, right? We wouldn't have a Mishnah if it weren't for him. And then we wouldn't have Gemara and we wouldn't be here today. So we think it's this amazing thing he did. But imagine in his time when they started writing down things that nobody was allowed to write down. I mean, there's all these statements. You can't write down the oral Torah. And he started writing it down. People must have been very against him. And they looked at him like an outsider, right? You don't belong here. You're revealing secrets. You're writing things that shouldn't be written. And they didn't want him to learn more because they said he's going to wreak more havoc and do problematic things. And then so right now it just popped into my head that maybe there's this idea about these tarnagolim. Exactly. So Amy, you're writing what I was thinking about, that the androgynous was excluded, right? And that he was on the outs and Rabbi Eliezer brought him in. Now, in a way that he gets stoned, but basically saying we treat this androgynous like a zachar. And maybe that's why that was the one halacha that he learned in terms of, I'm just like you, I'm no different. You think I'm a bria b'fnei atzmo. You think I'm different, but I'm really no different. So I think that's a nice idea. And I'm glad you thought of it also. With that, Hadron ala Ha'arel, moving on to the next chapter. So I thought it was a nice closure when you say the words Hadron ala Ha'arel, you remember we're in this chapter all about Arel, people who don't fit in and yet, try to fit in. So it's interesting. Okay. The next Mishnah, the next chapter starts off with a bit of a strange Mishnah. And Tosfot immediately jumps and says, okay, it does a huge review of many things we learned in the Masechet, which is really nice when you're learning Daf Yomi because we don't always review things. So first of all, that's good. Second of all, what's weird about it is that we've learned basically everything in this Mishnah. So why, or almost everything in this Mishnah. So why is it doing this? Why is it repeating? They're going to basically do what Mishnayot like to do, which is say there's 4 permutations. Okay, I'll start and then I'll read you the Tosfot. There's some cases where a woman will be permitted to her husband, but forbidden to the yabam, his brother. Or, right, that whole first Mishnah, right, where she was married and fell to yibum to someone she was forbidden to. There's some cases where they're permitted to the yabam, but they actually couldn't have married their husband in the first place. Their husband was permitted to them, but the yabam is forbidden to them. Okay, that's normal cases where a woman is permitted to her husband and she can go marry her yabam, his brother. And some cases where she can't marry her husband, and she can't marry his brother, right? Imagine that they're both relatives of hers in the same way, let's say. Okay, or we'll see. So we're now going to go through a million cases, okay, not a million, but there's actually, I number them, 15 cases in the Mishnah, plus maybe you count one as 16, but it's more of a general. And we're going to go through all these cases, and it's basically a good review. So Tosfot says, if you look at the first Tosfot on the Gemara here, Yesh Mutarot, in the chapter, the first Tosfot in our chapter, Peresh Rav Yehuda HaNasi, Dechen Derech HaTana. It's very common that the Tana does this, even though it's not the most common thing. After he explained all the halachas in the Masechet, Chozer v'shoneh otam b'lashon katzar, kedei she'im mesudarim b'picha, u'shmorim b'lev u'b'peh. He reviews them in a bit of a different way and organizes them so that they stick, right? You remember them, okay? So that's one interesting way of explaining it. Okay, let's start now with our presentation. And we will get going. Okay, so we start off with, we now have the case of mutarot, elu mutarot leba'alehem v'asurot li'ibnehem. In the classic style, the Mishnah listed 4 permutations. Okay, and now it's going to go through each one, although the order is going to be 1, 2, 4, 3. Instead of, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, the mutarot le'elu is going to be the last one, and when we get there, you'll see why. Kohen hedyot shenasa. So now I want to know women who are permitted to marry their husband, but when they fall to yibum, they will not be permitted to marry the yabam. Kohen hedyot shenasa ta'almana v'yesh lo ach kohen gadol. We have a widow who marries a kohen. That's allowed. Okay, but he has an ach kohen gadol. So when he dies and she falls to yibum to the high priest, to the kohen gadol, she's not allowed to marry him because she's a widow. Widow can't marry a kohen gadol. That's easy. Chalal shenasak shira. Okay, we now have a chalal. Chalal. So let's go through our case. We have a kohen who married a divorcee and a woman who is fit for marriage to a kohen. So we have the divorcee and the kohen have a child who's a chalal. The kohen also, though, has a regular kohen child, not who's disqualified. Okay, remember, chalal is a kohen who's disqualified. So now what happens? Chalal shenasak shera. He married a woman who was a kshera, a fit woman. Okay, meaning chalal, we're going to see later, can marry anybody. Chalal is not forbidden to marry. What's the problem? The halal's children will become halalim, but he himself anyone can marry a halal. It's just that their children. Okay, so. Now, what happens? They have an option. Either they have girls or they have boys. Chalal gives birth to a girl. She's a chalalah and can't marry a kohen. And then that's the end game. Her children don't become chalalim. But if he gives birth to a boy, that boy will be a halal, and halal goes down forever and ever and ever and ever. So in other words, through the males. So every male child of halal will be a halal. Okay? That means basically his whole lineage of kohenut is disqualified because they can't be kohenim. So now he marries this woman who he can marry, but yesh lo ach kasher. He has a brother from a different marriage, right, from the father's other wife, who cannot marry this woman who is, now why? She was fit. Why can't she marry him? Because when a regular woman, a kshera, we'll call her, or a fit woman, marries a halal, she becomes a halal also, okay? So it's not just that he messes up his children, but his wife becomes a halalah. So after she married, okay, and what messes her up? Marriage, not betrothal, but marriage. We're going to talk about this later today. So once she marries the halal, she becomes a halalah, and then she can't marry his brother if she falls yibum to his brother, who's a kohen kasher. Okay, that was case 2. Case 3. Yisrael shenasa bat Yisrael. Okay, a regular person married a regular person, all good. But yesh lo ach mamzer. So they can get married, but when he dies and she falls to yibum to the brother's a mamzer. She can't marry the mamzer. Mamzer shenasa mamzeret v'yesh lo ach Yisrael. So now we have a mamzer marries a mamzeret. Okay, so that's permitted. Mamzerim can marry each other, but he has a brother who's not a mamzer. Okay, right? Not from the same union of his father and mother. So because of that, right, again, they share the same father, but obviously their mother is not the same. And therefore the mamzeret will be not permitted to do yibum with the ach Yisrael. Okay, so, sorry, I'm just looking inside. Now, mamzer. Okay, those are all, that's the end of the first four cases. There's 5, but we'll get to the 5th later because it's a rabbinic. These are mutarot lebalehem, asurot liyivmehem, according to the Mishnah. Okay, next case. Elu mutarot liyivmehem, asurot lebalehem. Okay, I would have said it the reverse, but these are forbidden to have gotten married in the first place, but they're actually permitted to the yabam. It's kind of ironic. So what is this? Kohen gadol shekidesh almana. If he betrothed a widow, that's forbidden. Now, if he marries her, she becomes a chalala. But if he just betroths her, she doesn't become a chalala. And therefore, if he's just kidesha almana, he betroths her, v'yesh lo ach kohen idiot, and he has a brother who's a regular kohen, then when he dies, the high priest, then the widow is allowed to marry the kohen idiot, the regular kohen, okay, the common priest. So that's the first case. Next, kasher shenasa chalala. Okay, we have a regular kohen, a good kohen, who married a chalala. Okay, her father was a chalal, or her father was a kohen who married a divorcee. Okay, now she marries a kohen, she's not allowed to. That's a prohibited marriage. But yesh lo ach chalal. If that kohen had a brother who was a chalal, then when she falls to yibum to the brother because her husband dies without children, she's permitted to the chalal because she's a chalala, and that's not a problem. Yisrael shenasa mamzeret. So a regular Israelite marries a mamzeret, which is a prohibited marriage, but yesh lo ach mamzer. He happens to have a brother. Again, brother always has to mean they share the same father, but obviously they don't share the same mother. His father cheated on his mother and ended up with a mamzer. So then the mamzeret, if her husband dies, who she wasn't allowed to be married to in the first place, right, she can now marry the yabam. By the way, I'm reminding you, all these cases are chayve lavim, which means that the kiddushin are tofsim. There is a valid marriage, even though it was a prohibited marriage. If there was no valid marriage, there'd be no obligation of yibum. Mamzer shenasa bat Yisrael v'yesh lo ach mamzer. So now we have a mamzer who marries a regular Jewish girl, which is prohibited, but he happens to have a brother who's a Yisrael. It's the actual opposite of the other case. Okay, it sounds very complicated. These are pretty simple, straightforward cases. Mutarot liyivmehem v'asurot lebalehem. So all these cases, right? Again, another 4 cases are mutarot. They can marry their yabam, but they actually couldn't have been married in the first place to their first husband. Okay, now that's the end of that case. Okay, now we get asurot ve'elu asurot le'elu le'elu. These are prohibited to both. Okay, what would be the case? Now, instead of a kohen, a widow that was betrothed to a high priest, now we're going to have the widow actually marry the high priest. Once she marries the high priest, she becomes a chalala. She can no longer marry a high priest, or she can no longer marry a regular, a common priest. So kohen gadol shenasata almana v'yesh lo ach kohen gadol lo kohen idiot. He has a brother who's also a high priest. How could this happen? Well, maybe when he dies, his brother takes over. Alternatively, maybe he was a high priest, and then his brother later was a high priest. And once you're a high priest, you have high priest status forever. So it could be he was no longer the acting high priest, and his brother was, or the reverse. So the widow basically becomes a chalala when she marries the first husband, and then she becomes forbidden to any other kohen, whether he's a kohen hidyot or a kohen ragil. So when the high priest dies, she can't marry either of the brothers. Kasher shenasa chalala v'yesh lo ach kasher. So again, same idea. A regular kohen marries a chalala, which is prohibited. It could be a divorcee. It could be any of those. And then she becomes, right, in this case, it would be, right, they take a chalala because they want to show you that he prohibits her. No, sorry. It doesn't matter. It could be anyone he marries who can't marry. Prohibited to him and obviously prohibited to his kohen brother. right? Because as long as his brother was kasher, then she can't marry him as well. Next. Okay, so if the first kohen dies, then all are prohibited, right? All his brothers are prohibited as well. Yisrael shenasa mamzeret and yeshloach Yisrael. Again, this is just going to be just like she could marry the first one, she couldn't marry the second one because both are Yisraelim and she's a mamzeret who can't marry. And the flip case, mamzer shenasa bat Yisrael. If there was a mamzer who married a bat Yisrael, then that's still that case. A mamzer that marries a bat Yisrael, which was a prohibited marriage, v'yeshloach mamzer. Let's say there's two mamzer brothers. Okay, so just like the Yisrael couldn't marry the first one, she also can't marry the second one. So those are asurot le'elu u'le'elu. Okay, those are forbidden to both. Ush'ar kol hanashim mutarot leba'alehem u'liyivmehem. Okay, all other women. Okay, this doesn't really mean all other women, and we'll get to this in the Gemara. There are more than this, but what they mean is, but a random case, like a regular case, normally you have a woman who marries a man, she falls yibum to the brother, and everyone's permitted to everyone the same way she was permitted to the brother. The first husband, she's permitted to his brother as well. That's just a regular, typical case of yibum. Shniot midivrei sofrim. Now we're going to add a case to, and by the way, now you see why the order, even though they ordered it, which made sense to order it, permitted, forbidden, right? The case number 3 was permitted to all, and case number 4 was forbidden to all. When it comes to the description of the cases, they started with the asurim lezeh because they were more complicated cases you needed to spell out, whereas the mutarim was just everything else. So that's why they did 1, 2, 4, 3 in terms of the order of the description. Now we go back and we're going to bring, for the 3 categories that we've been discussing, not the permitted to both, but all the other 3, we're now going to bring a case that's rabbinic. Okay, so shniot, if you remember, is what's called shniot, which is all rabbinic arayot. Like, for example, we'll give this one example of aim imo. Okay, Yosef's mother's mother. Okay, so here we have a chart. Lavan and Dalia are married to each other. Lavan has a daughter, Rachel, right? These are names that are commonly known to you. Yaakov marries also Zilpah. So Yaakov has 2 wives. And with those right here, 4, but for this purpose, he had 2 sons from each of those wives. So he has Yosef from Rachel and Asher from Zilpah. Now, Yosef is related to Lavan's wife. It's his grandmother. It's his mother's mother. Now, mother's mother is only prohibited on a rabbinic level. But Asher, notice, is not related to Lavan's wife because he comes from Yaakov and Zilpah, who have nothing to do with Lavan. Okay? So that's a good case of shniot. So here we're going to see. Shniot midivrei sofrim, shniya labal velo shniya liyabam. Okay, we're going to they're going actually into category 2 first. They're going to show a case. I don't know why they went out of order again, but where she can't marry her husband, but she can marry the yabam. Okay, so let's say Dalia, the grandmother, goes down and marries Yosef. Okay, she marries her grandson. So that's a prohibited marriage. But the yabam is Asher, the brother who has no relationship to Yael, so she'd be permitted to Asher. Asura labal umuteret layabam. Right? So that's a case where she'd be forbidden to the husband, Yosef, but permitted to the yabam. Next case, shniya la yabam velo shniya labal. What if she's shniya the yabam? What if in the end she marries Asher and Yosef is the yabam? So that's a case of obviously the reverse. Asura yabam umuteret labal. She was permitted to marry her husband because he wasn't a relative of hers, but she was forbidden to the yabam. When Asher dies, she falls to yibum to Yosef, and that's forbidden. Shniya lezeh ulezeh, asura lezeh ulezeh. What if it wasn't the situation we just described, but instead it was just Rachel and Yaakov had Binyamin, Yosef and Binyamin, and Dalia married? It really doesn't matter now, either one of them. She marries Yosef, which was a prohibited marriage, and now she falls to Yibum to Binyamin, who's also prohibited to her. So again, that will be asura lezeh ulezeh. Well, she'll be forbidden both to Yosef and to Binyamin. Okay, now, in talking about this shniot, the Gemara is now going to say, "Ein la lo ktuba v'lo perot v'lo mizonot v'lo blaot v'avlad kasher v'kofino tolotzi." All these laws apply. There's a bunch of different interpretations of what some of these mean. I'm going to just go with one interpretation, but know if you're looking at a commentary, you might be able to find some other interpretations. I want to just keep it simple for now because it's a bit of a long daf. She doesn't get her ktuba money. Okay, they penalize her in the cases of the Durabbanans. Okay, often we see that where in Durabbanans they penalize more because they worry people won't take it seriously. So if he marries someone who's his grandmother, let's say from his mother's side, She loses her ktuba. Okay. Now they're going to ask later why they penalize only her and not him. Okay. But she loses her ktuba. She doesn't get payroll. That means, again, according to some interpretations, there were certain, remember the money she brings into the marriage, he gets to get the proceeds of the nichse melug and the tzon barzel. He gets to use them while they're married. And so that's payroll, which is all the money he makes off them. You would think theoretically, if she doesn't get her ktuba, she could demand all the payback, the produce back, because in the end, she's not going to get her stuff. She should at least get all the produce, all the money he made. No, she loses that as well. Lo mizona, she doesn't get fed mizona, which is one of the conditions in the stipulations in the ketubah that she gets food. And lo balaot, which again, different interpretations, but some people, Rashi says it's the nichse tzon barzel, which if you remember, the ones that she gets back at the value they went into the marriage. But we had a whole discussion that theoretically she could demand back the item itself, even though really only she's deserving of the value of it. But if they're, right, she doesn't even get back shreds here. Like if there's shreds of clothing, like ripped clothing, that's balaot, things that are worn out. She doesn't even get the worn out clothing to take back, and she doesn't get them back at all. Again, some people interpret it somewhat differently and say she does get them back. Again, there's many different interpretations here. We're going to actually see this group in a bunch of Mishnayot going forward. The havlad kasher. Now, since it's only derabbanan, we don't call the vlad a mamzer. But we do try to force him to divorce her. These are all what we call chayvei lavim, negative commandments by Torah law, as opposed to the derabbanans. Well, in that case, yesh lahen ketubah. They actually do get their ketubah. We'll get to this in the Gemara in tomorrow's daf, why those cases she does get her ketubah. Now we're going to go back to the Mishnah with questions of the Gemara on the Mishnah. We're going to start going through the cases, and that's why I numbered them to make it easier to discuss. So we're going to have two questions on the first Mishnah and the language used in the first Mishnah and the case used in the first Mishnah. So the first question is, my iria detane nasa litne kidesh. What was the first case? I'm sure you don't remember. A kohen idiot, a regular kohen, shenasa et almana. He marries a widow. V'yesh lo ach kohen gadol. So when he marries the widow, what happens? She becomes right. She is actually permitted to marry him. So there's no issue there. But when she falls to the kohen gadol, she is now a widow. Now, in this case, she'd be forbidden to the yabam whether they were married or whether they were betrothed. Remember case number, if you look at the first cases in each category, if you have the chart in front of you, it's the easiest. Case number 6, we had a kohen gadol shekidesh et almana v'yesh la kohen idiot, which was different, right? If he only betroths. Now, here it's a different case entirely. It's a kohen gadol, it's not a kohen idiot. And it's kiddushin, not nisuin. So if he betroths a widow, and he's a kohen gadol, which was a forbidden marriage, it doesn't make her a chalala because it was only a betrothal. And that's why she doesn't become a chalala, and she can marry a kohen idiot. But in case number 11, in the assertion elu was a kohen gadol shenasa almana. He actually married her. That turns her into a chalala. She can't even marry a kohen idiot. So if you notice, they play with, right, they say which one is even kiddushin will be relevant, or marriage. Now, in our case, if she was an almana, she could fall to yibum even by just being betrothed to the brother. And the issue here is that she's a widow. And she was a widow before. She's still a widow. Even if she was only betrothed, she'd be called a widow, even if she wasn't even a widow before. But from this marriage, she'd be a widow. And then she'd go marry the kohen gadol. That would be forbidden because a widow can't marry a kohen gadol. So it doesn't matter betrothal or marriage. So why does it use the term betrothal? We're going to see later. It also doesn't matter if she was a widow before. Now she's a widow. She could have been a betulah. She could have been a virgin before, never married. And she'd still be an almanan, forbidden to the kohen gadol. So those are going to be our two questions. Why does it say married and not betrothed? And why does it say widow from the beginning, even if she was not a widow from the beginning, when he dies, which is yibum, would have to be that he died in order to have her fall to yibum to the brother, she'd become a widow and then she'd be forbidden to the kohen gadol anyway. So those are our two questions. First, the first one. Why does it say nasa litne kidesh? Maybe because he married her, now she's also a bi'ula, meaning she's not a virgin anymore. Remember, kohen gadol has to marry a virgin. That's a mitzvah aseh. Isha b'b'tula. He has to marry a woman who's a virgin. And she's also now, so if she's married, she's no longer that. So he's not doing the mitzvah aseh of marrying a virgin. And there's a mitzvah lo taseh of a widow. Don't marry a widow, it says in the Torah. So because it's an aseh v'lo taseh, but maybe aval kidesh, if it's just that she was betrothed, she's still a virgin, then ate aseh v'docha lo taseh. Maybe the mitzvah aseh of yibum will override the mitzvah lo taseh of don't marry an almana. So that's why they said nasa, because it has both, and that's why yibum doesn't override. But you can't say that because all the other cases are all simple cases of a lo taseh, and the mitzvah aseh of yibum doesn't override them. We don't say, oh, you can't marry a mamzer, but if it's yibum, we allow it. So that's not a good answer. The reason they said married was to show that there's two things going on, and that's why you can't do yibum. It's not true. So second option, mishum de kabay lebit neseifa. Maybe it's to have it correspond to the end of our Mishnah. Okay, again, if you look at if you take a cut of the first three cases of the first case in each of the three sections, we're going to now compare it to the first in the last section. Because it says in the Seifa, kohen gadol shenasat almana, and there it's only if he married her, right? Because that turns her into a chalala, and then she can't even marry his kohen head, your brother, and that would be a case of asulin lezeh ulezeh. There it's dafka nasat, the shavia chalala. Aval kidesh shariale, but if it was just a betrothal, she'd be permitted. Therefore, Tananami Reisha Nasa. Maybe they just wanted the language to be parallel to case number 11. So they said Nasa. But obviously that's not a good answer because Adatani Mishum Seifa, if you're saying they made it to have parallel language, well, Litni Mishum Mitziata. The middle case of Mutarot Liyev Vasurot Labalehem, case number 6, the first case of category 2, is Kidesh. So if you want to make it parallel to that language, why don't you make it parallel to that language and say Kidesh, betrothed? So your argument that we wanted to make it parallel to there doesn't work because it could have been, for all intents and purposes, parallel to the one closer to it anyway, right? And therefore, because it says there, that doesn't work. So third answer, it's because of the next case in the Mishnah, case number 2. Forget about comparing it to the first case in the other categories. The language of nasa was used to compare it to the next case. What's the next case in the Mishnah? What happened here? A chalal marries a woman who was permitted to him. Now, what happens when a chalal marries a woman? He turns her into a chalala. That's only through marriage. If he just betrothed her, she wouldn't be a chalala. All these women, remember, the kohanim can't have a sexual relationship with one of the forbidden women. So betrothal, yes, it's forbidden, but it doesn't make her a chalala until they actually enter into a marriage. So that's specifically marriage. Tama de nasad shavi chalala, because then she becomes a chalala. But if it was just betrothal, it would be permitted. Therefore, mishum hachi de katane nasa. That's why case number 1 said nasad. Compare it to case number 2. Okay, meaning just to use the same language. Really, it didn't need to say that. It could have said kidesh, but because of it. That was question number 1. We had 3 possible answers. We finally ended with the third. The others didn't really work. My area de katane almana lini betula. Now we get to the second question that I already said. Could have just been a virgin. He marries a non-almana, which was permitted to him. Okay, that's what we're looking for anyway. Even an almana is permitted, but of course they're permitted. And then when he dies and she falls to the brother, she's already a widow. So that would have been a good case. She would have been forbidden to the kohen gadol in any case. Moving now to Amabet. B'chitema kasaval, maybe he holds. Now, this is a fascinating havamina, a fascinating thought that maybe you would think. Maybe kasavar haitana, the Tana of our Mishnah thought that nisu'in harishonim mipilim. What makes you forbidden to the yabam? If you were forbidden when you married the guy in the first place. Meaning, let's just think about it. The way we know it to be, no kohen gadol can ever do yibum, because what does yibum mean? It means that the wife is a widow, because there wouldn't be yibum without widow. So a kohen gadol is never going to be able to do that. But what this is suggesting is maybe when we determine can a kohen gadol marry this woman or a regular kohen, maybe it follows the status of the woman when she married the brother. Because if he's really filling the place of the brother, maybe we say, if she was an almana when she married his brother, like our case in our Mishnah, then she'll be forbidden to the kohen gadol. But if she was not a widow and she married the kohen gadol, the regular kohen, and he dies and she's now a widow, that's not a widow that's forbidden to a kohen gadol, because he's only forbidden in yibum to a woman who was a widow when she married her first husband. Okay, that's a very interesting thought, that we go by what her status was then and not now. It's just a suggestion. They don't accepted. But right now they're suggesting maybe that's why they specifically said she was already a widow. Because if she wasn't a widow before, she wouldn't be forbidden. Well, we're going to disprove it from case number 2 in the Mishnah. What does case number 2 say? Chalal shanasak shera. Chalal marries a woman who was permitted to marry a chalal. Everyone's permitted to marry a chalal. It's just what happens when they marry them? They become a chalala. So if a chalal married a kshera, now, what did we say? She's forbidden to his brother, the kohen, because now she became a chalala. Now, what was her status when she married the brother? She wasn't a chalala. So if we say she can't marry the yabam, it's clear that we don't go by nisuin rishonim. We go by at the moment of yibum, what was her status? So therefore, havadai mishum, below amrina nisuin rishonim mipilim. We don't say, oh, she's permitted to his brother because she was permitted to the first husband, and we go by what her status was then. No, we don't say that. So again, we're trying to figure out why it said almanah then, if that's not the reason. Havadai mishum seifa. Mishum dekabai limit neseifa, kohen gadol shenasat almanah, v'yesh lo ach kohen gadol o kohen idyov, davka almanah v'abtula chazele, mishumachi katane almanah. It was really to parallel it to case number 11, going back to the argument we tried to make before, which is since case number 11, the first case in Asulim Lezeh, they wanted to foil them. So they said, let's take the exact same case, but with a minor variation. In the first case, it's a kohen idiot that marries the almanah, which was a permitted marriage, except she'll be forbidden to the yabam. In case number 11, it's a kohen gadol that marries the almanah, and that's a forbidden relationship, and that's why it's asulim lezeh ulezeh. Okay, so that explains why they use the language of almanah, just to match it, to parallel it to case number 11. But they really could have said bitula. So therefore, right there, it's only an almanah, because again, that case we had to say it was a forbidden marriage to the first one, and then he made her a chalala, so then she becomes forbidden even to a regular kohen, even though a widow normally can marry a regular kohen. Rav Papa now asks the question and says, wait a minute, and this is going to get a little complicated again. It's a bit of a complicated daf. But now we say, Im ita lahaki ata Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Yochanan. If we really hold like Rav Dimi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, we saw a few dapim ago, that what? Mitzri Sheni, remember the Mitzrim? First and second generation are forbidden, but third generation are already permitted. But third generation, how does it go? By the mother or the father? Let's say a Mitzri Rishon marries a Mitzri Sheni. Is that child third or is it second? So Mitzri Sheni, Shanasa Mitzri Rishona, Bena Sheni Hav. Okay, if a Mitzri second generation marries a Mitzri Rishona, she's a first generation, the child is a Sheni. Okay, it goes by the mother. So Litni Nami, if that's the case, if we would hold by him, then there should be more cases in our Mishnah. What would be cases in our Mishnah that they could have brought? Okay, now we're going to go through a bunch of cases. Again, it sounds a little complicated, but it's not terribly complicated. So if this is just what we just said, right? So we have a first generation Egyptian marries an Israelite woman, let's say. Their child is a Mitzri Sheni, second generation. He marries a first generation, the child will again be a second generation because it goes by the mother. That's what Rav Dimi said that Rabbi Yochanan held. So now Rav Papa says the following. There should be more cases in the Mishnah than if he was right. What would be a good case? Mitzri Sheni shenasa shtei mitzriyot. We have a second generation Egyptian who marries two women each. Right. Again, the theory is going to be like this. If it all goes by the mother, then a father potentially could have two kids that are different statuses. Because if he married a first generation Mitzri and a second generation Mitzri, which by the way are both permitted to him, right? He could end up with one son who's a second generation Egyptian and one son who's a third generation Egyptian. So again, each wife, one is first and one is second. So the banim are each, one is second generation, one is third generation. Now we're going to have a few different permutations. If they married like their own, meaning people they were permitted to marry, assume it was a valid marriage. So second generation Mitzri marries another second generation Mitzri, and the third generation Mitzri marries a regular Israelite because he's already permitted. Then mutarot le'balehem. So these are obviously permitted marriages, but asurot li'ibnehen. But each one can't marry the others if they were to die. Each one can't marry. Okay, I didn't make them dead here because one has to be right. Each one has to be alive for each option. But if one of them were to die, each wife, the Israelite, can't marry a second generation Egyptian, and the second generation Egyptian can't marry the third generation Egyptian because he's already permitted and she's not. So that case is missing. The ipuch, and let's say they each married the opposite. they each married the one that was forbidden to them. The second generation Egyptian married an Israelite, and the third generation Egyptian married the second generation Egyptian woman. Then it would be a case of mutarot yibmehem v'asurot lebalehem. They can't marry their husbands, but theoretically, if there was yibum, they'd each be permitted to the yabam. Okay, now mutarot le'elu. Here's some more cases that could have been giorot. Okay, what if now a convert can marry both a third generation Egyptian and a second generation Egyptian, because converts can go back and forth, right? We had debates about this, but assuming you hold that a convert is not called kahal Yisrael, so they can both be in the kahal, but they can marry mamzerim, they can marry anyone who's not allowed. So they'd be, if they each married converts and then they died, their wives could marry either one of them. It would be a good case of permitted to everybody. And asurot le'elu would be Iloniot. If an Iloni Israelite married, right, she couldn't marry the second generation Egyptian, right? She also can't marry the third generation Egyptian because if he doesn't have children, he's not allowed to marry an Iloni. So theoretically, she can't marry either one. If she married, let's say, the second generation Egyptian, so then she'd be forbidden to him and forbidden to the other one. Here, I didn't show the whole thing. You can just imagine it at this point, right? She basically can't marry either one of them, and therefore she'd be asurim ulizeh, right? Remember, she also doesn't have the mitzvah of yibum. So she'd be forbidden to do yibum because she's not obligated in yibum because she can't have children. The whole idea of yibum is to have children. So basically, he says, I don't understand why you don't have that case. To which the Gemara answers, Tana v'shir. Don't ask that question and say, Rav Dimi must be wrong because all these cases don't appear here. No, the Mishnah just left out cases. Now, whenever they say the Mishnah left out cases, we've seen this recently, you have to say, my shiur to high shiur. What else did they leave out? It's not like they leave out one case. Now, here it's interesting because they leave out a whole slew of cases, but I guess they're all one category of the mitzvah. So what else did they leave out? Shiur p'tsuadaka. They didn't talk about a p'tsuadaka, a guy who can't marry at all, right? Let's say he has a brother who's not a p'tsuadaka. So again, she'd be forbidden to him, permitted to the brother. Okay, so they say, nah, that's not a good answer. They just have one category of chayve lavim, and he's a chayve lav. He's included in the Mishnah, right? Mamzer, let's say. Mamzer's chayve lavim. It's no different than p'tsuadaka. You could just substitute in instead of that. It's not that they left it out. It's that he's included. They say, wait. Wait a minute. You want to say there's one case of chayve lavim that teaches you about all the chayve lavim, but that's not true. There's a lot of cases of chayve lavim in the Mishnah, right? Negative commandments. Like, for example, haktane kohen hedyot shenasa almana, the chalal shenasa kshera, right? A kohen hedyot that marries an almana, and then then it's a kohen gadol. That's a chayve lavim. And the chalal shenasa kshera, and then she goes to marry the brother. She's a chalala to a kohen. Those are two different cases of chayve lavim, and yet they mention them separately. So again, if you say they mention them separately, then p'tsuadaka is missing because it should have been mentioned separately. No. Those are mentioned separately because they wanted to teach you something else, not because we list all the chayve lavim, but there was we had ulterior motive here. How eats They want to teach you the following halacha, which is a bat kohen is an interesting halacha. To Amar Rabbi Yehuda HaMarav, lo zeruk kshirot linaseh lepsulim. Kshirot benot kohen, okay, a bat kohen, the daughter of a kohen, doesn't have an issue marrying a psul. What does it mean, a psul? Like a chalal. A bat kohen, it's not like it's forbidden. You might think maybe a chalal can only marry a Yisraeli, but a bat kohen can't marry a disqualified kohen. No, it's not true. Bat kohen is allowed to, and that's what the Mishnah wanted to teach us by saying chalal shanasak shera was telling us she's permitted to the husband. In other words, they're calling kshera a bat kohen. Okay, they're saying just like kasher is a kohen kasher, a kshera is a bat kohen kshera. She can even marry a chalal. That's what they wanted to teach you. V'ha katane, but wait. Here's another case that didn't need to be mentioned. Chalal shanasak shera, right? Once you have that case, Yisrael shanasa by Yisrael v'yesh lo ach mamzer. That's another case of chayve lavim. In other words, we still have additional cases we don't need. Say no. Ha-nami lo mahadr mitnehi. Tashmuin alav she'en shaveh b'kol. Kamash malav shaveh b'kol. There's chayve lavim that relate to only kohanim. It's not for everybody. And then they wanted to tell you chayve lavim that are for everybody, like a mamzer. So you needed that and you need that. So again, p'tsuadaka you can't say it was left off. It was really included in mamzer. And the fact that there's all these other cases doesn't really prove that they listed each chayve lav separate and p'tsuadaka should have been in there. So they say, no, but now we're going to really disprove it because it says, Yisrael shenasa mamzeret v'yesh lo ach Yisrael. Umamzer shenasa mamzeret v'yesh lo ach Yisrael. In other words, we had a case of Yisrael that married a mamzeret, and we had a case of a mamzer shenasa mamzeret and then with the brother. In other words, there are multiple cases of chayve lavim here because they do mamzer from different perspectives, and therefore elalav shmamina tana shiur shmamina. They end with saying you can say tana v'shiur. Psuadaka should have been in there because why did they mention a bunch of cases of mamzerim if not that they wanted to list a whole bunch of chayve lavim, and therefore they should have listed it. The fact that it's not there basically shows that's not there. Also, the mitzri cases aren't there, and it's no question that Rav Papa asked. It's not really a question on Rav Dimi. Gufa. Now we'll just end with this last little section. Gufa Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav Lo V'Zeruk Sherot Linaseh L'Psulim. So Rabbi Yehuda said, we're now going to quote this halacha that we said about the bat kohen is permitted to marry. You know, he's an Amora. He made the statement. So comes the Gemara and said, we just learned that from the Mishnah. So why don't we say the Mishnah supports his statement? Lema Masayele Chalal Shenasak Shera. Is it not my love the way we understood it 2 minutes ago? Kohenet HaRe'uyalo. Shera means a daughter of a kohen. And then it's saying she is actually permitted to her husband. She can marry a chalal. Umay kshera lekuna, right? Kshera means she's permitted to marry a kohen. Lo Yisraeli. Umay kshera lekahal. No, it's talking about a Yisraeli. And kshera means kshera to marry any Jew. And it doesn't necessarily mean, right? Kshera, who's to say it means a bat kohen. So they say, wait, if you want to say kshera in that aspect, in that line in the Mishnah means kshera lekahal, then we're going to have a problem because now, when we said yeshlo ach kasher, we obviously meant a kohen. That was all the cases of he has an ach kasher. It meant a kohen kasher who wasn't a chalal. That's not kasher l'kahal. Michlal shu pasul l'kahal, right? And then the kasher is kasher l'kahal. The pasul is pasul l'kahal. No, the kasher was kasher to marry, right? It was kasher to be a kohen, and the pasul was he's a chalal. He's not a kohen. So ela lav kohenu. We do ku kohen, he kohenes. And they say if kasher meant kohen, then shera means kohenet, bat kohen. So they say, no, mididiria hakadita. No, the kasher when it came to the kohen was kohen. The kasher when it came to the woman was Yisraelit kshera. And it meant she wasn't a mamzeret or something like that. You don't have to say just the word kasher and kshera in this Mishnah, all must mean the same thing. And basically that shows that our Mishnah doesn't necessarily prove that a bat kohen can marry a chalal. Now, it happens to be she can, but you can't necessarily prove it from our Mishnah. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll finish up the daf tomorrow. It's a bit of a long daf. Hopefully tomorrow we'll be able to catch up and finish to the end of the page. Have a great day, everybody.